religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. At first, I want to, this hour, spend some time looking at some issues in the news. And next hour, we'll have Rafael Cruz in studio. One of the reasons we wanted to do that is we have, of course, had this theme, socialism, a clear and present danger. And 2 weeks ago, we had our truth team, which candidly wasn't as good as we would like it to have been. And I think part of it is sometimes when we talk about socialism, for the younger generation, they go, hey, what's wrong with it? The older generation goes, oh, Jan, it's the same old, same old. And so we really wanted to spend some time talking with somebody who grew up in Cuba. Born, I think he was late 1930s, and so he had a chance to see what it was like to actually transition that country into a socialist utopia, and it turned out to be a dystopia. So we're going to be talking about him in the studio. And if you'd like to join us or make some comments, we would love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Doug Groothuis will be with us on the third hour, I might just mention as well. And we have a couple of articles. Of course, you may know him as an individual that does a great deal in the area of apologetics. But we're going to add to that music. And that is, he has written a piece called How Jazz Can Shape Apologetics. You go, oh, I got to hear that. That's exactly why we decided it. We wanted to have him on that. He wrote a piece a little while back on how to listen to jazz, and really going to be talking about so that we don't just always think of apologetics as kind of a left hemisphere linear arguments for the existence of God or evidence for the reliability of the Bible. But there's also what we've been talking about these last couple of weeks when we have a chance to do so, about what might be called cultural apologetics. Because after all, if indeed our goal as Christians is to talk about what is true and what is beautiful, as well as many other things, that is certainly something we can talk about. So before we get too much further, what is beautiful has been destroyed. Yesterday, you have one of those questions. Okay, should I talk about the fact that there's a fire in Notre Dame? And the idea was, well, no, maybe we'll just wait and see if some very good material has been written about that. And no surprise, organizations that have 10 times our budget and about 3 to 4 times as many staff writers have put together some great material. Some are written by individuals, but some of those are probably done with some research. And I thought I would just share an idea here or there from that, because this has, of course, been a great loss to our Western culture. And as you might imagine, people like Dennis Prager and others have had some things to say about that. I'm sure John Stonestreet has one coming out soon on Breakpoint, and so we'll get into that. But Rich Lowry calls it Weep for Notre Dame. Notre Dame stands for so many qualities we now lack: patience and staying power, the cultivation of beauty, a deep religious faith, and cultural confidence and ambition to build a timeless monument to our civilization. So much I could say about that. And again, we may post some of these articles, but you can read them for yourself. But just take two of the words he used there, staying power or patience. Maybe patience would work with the timeless monument of our civilization. I mean, it was not something that was constructed within a decade. It was not something that was constructed even within a century. That just blows the modern mind. When individuals were building the great cathedrals, they knew that they would die long before it was completed. They would never get to see the reality of what they built. And today, when we put up structures quickly and are quite willing to tear them down very quickly, it is kind of interesting, especially when you look at the intricacy of what was carved into the stone. People from time to time, when they join me as a guest, mention that I went to Yale, and I don't make a big deal about that, but if you ever go to Harvard or especially to Yale, you would see some things that you would think were built actually during the Middle Ages, because there's very intricate carvings in the stone work that are in some of the various colleges at the university there. And it just so happens that those were done in large part during the 1930s, because during the Great Depression, individuals who had a lot of time on their hands and would be willing to work for fairly cheap were able to actually carve some things that look like they might have been done in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, but actually were just done a few decades ago. But it really is hard to imagine anything like that being built today. And, of course, the fire in Notre Dame is one of the reasons to weep for it. John Smirek said, are we too primitive to rebuild Notre Dame? Goes into the fact that he tells the story of weeping in front of, in this particular case, it was just their local parish that was on fire. But for them, it was like Notre Dame in Paris. And as a result, talks about the fact that, maybe we're just too primitive. We don't have a dedication to excellence and a dedication to beauty like we used to have. And I thought it was interesting. One of the very first articles that the National Review posted, and I was wondering how they did this, because it was talking about panhandling for the Notre Dame Cathedral. And then I looked and said, oh, well, this was actually posted in 2017. And the point he was making was, interestingly enough, when there was an attempt to try to refurbish, which is, of course, what they were doing right then, there was an inability sometimes to actually raise enough money for it because, and this shouldn't surprise you, because most of France today is a very secular state. You can see why French people would say, why do I want to spend money refurbishing and even in some cases rebuilding a Catholic cathedral? And of course, just even from a pragmatic point of view, because it's one of the biggest tourist attractions in Paris. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. But no, that was something that was written actually 2 years ago about how it was difficult to even raise the funds for it. Now, the President Macron says he is going to help rebuild that. We will see. And we'll see what kind of protest comes from all the secularists out there, maybe even all the Muslims in France who say, why are we spending French tax dollars to rebuild a Catholic cathedral? And I think you can kind of see the issue here, because it illustrates what I'll talk about after the break, because a number of individuals have said this burning of the cathedral in some respects is an omen for our Western culture, or as Nate Jackson says, a metaphor for Western civilization. So I want to read two short pieces by Dennis Prager and Nate Jackson. I suspect there will be many more coming in the future, but it was, I think, telling that even 2 years ago, there was kind of this big question mark as to whether or not there even would be enough money available to actually just simply refurbish some of the things in the cathedral that were beginning to, for obvious reasons, after centuries, begin to decay or fall apart. Well, we'll see now whether or not that particular statement becomes prophetic or prescient, and if it is, then you heard it first here on Point of View. We come back, let's talk briefly about what the burning of the cathedral might also illustrate as a metaphor or as an illustration of what's happening in Western culture at large. And then we'll get into some of the articles we posted on the website. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democrats in the House of Representatives are moving a bill that would more than double the nationwide minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's all part of the campaign to fight for 15 that may be doing more harm than good. I've documented in previous commentaries that there will be winners and losers. The winners are those who receive the bump in pay. The losers are those who receive a pink slip or aren't even hired in the first place. The editors at the Wall Street Journal notice what is happening in New York City when the minimum wage rose again on December 31st. Businesses with 11 or more workers must pay $15 an hour. They wonder if it is mere coincidence that the city's full-service restaurants have fallen into a jobs recession. Employment in January dropped more than 3%, and it appears like it dropped a little bit more in February. The New York City Hospitality Alliance surveyed hundreds of eateries last year and found that nearly half planned to eliminate jobs in 2019 due to higher labor costs. 3/4 plan to cut employee hours. The editors also point to a research paper that raises a question that never occurred to me. The economists found robust evidence that minimum wage hikes increase property crime arrest among teenagers and young adults ages 16 to 24, a population for whom minimum wages are likely to bind. The economists provide some sobering estimates about the possible increased costs due to property crimes. The current bill in Congress makes no adjustment for the cost of living, so the editors conclude that a cashier in New York, Texas, population 9, cannot be paid a dime less than the $15 an hour due in New York City. If passed, this bill could do significant harm. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as we were talking about the Notre Dame Cathedral, I thought for just a few minutes I might get just a couple of commentaries, which maybe we'll pick up some more of those on Friday, because Dennis Prager calls it an omen. He says the symbolism of the burning of the cathedral is the most renowned building in Western civilization. The iconic symbol of Western Christendom is hard to miss. It is as if God himself wanted to warn us in the most unmistakable way, Dennis Prager says, that Western Christianity is burning, and with it, Western civilization. Every major Western and major non-Western, I should say, social intellectual force has conspired to rid Europe of Christianity and civilization that it produced. Within the Western world, the French Enlightenment, the intellectual basis of the French Revolution, and the modern West sought to replace Christianity and religion in general with secularism rooted in reason. No God, no Bible, no Ten Commandments are necessary for morality and meaning. Reason and science will replace them. The two final death blows, Dennis Prager says, to Christianity in Europe were the World Wars. World War I ended most of the Western's belief in the nation state and the West. Christianity, already weakened by the Enlightenment, was further weakened by World War I. Never really thought about that until I read this today, because he points out that German Christians were killing millions of French and English Christians, and French and English Christians were killing millions of German Christians. So the argument and sentiment against Christianity went. Then World War II saw even more death on the Christian continent, as well as the failure of the Catholic and Protestant churches in Nazi Germany to offer even minimal non-compliance with the Nazis' Jew hatred. With the end of World War II, every internal Western intellectual doctrine was secular. God, the Bible, and religion were regarded as best as innocuous nonsense, and at worst, noxious nonsense. Meanwhile, Europeans brought a non-European ideology into Europe, an ideology that for more than 1,000 years sought to replace Christianity as the world's dominant religion. The Europeans believed in nothing distinctly Christian or Western, and believing in the moral intellectual nonsense known as multiculturalism, a doctrine that asserts that all cultures are morally equivalent, saw nothing problematic in bringing millions of Muslims into Europe. They had no idea that most of these people actually wanted to replace Christianity with their religion. They had no idea because in their ignorance and arrogance, they assumed that because they were secular multiculturalist, everybody else was too, or at least would be once they lived in Europe. They were wrong, of course, Dennis Prager says, and as a result, the two dominant forces in Europe, secular leftism and Islamism, sought the end of Christianity and the West. The left believes that protecting Western civilization is equivalent to protecting white supremacy. This is not producing a pretty picture. Generally speaking, Islam has not been nearly as kind, tolerant, open, and medically and scientifically innovative and intellectually curious as Western civilization. And he says, and yes, Nazism and communism were born in the West, but they were anti-Western. Even without tens of millions of Muslims, post-Christian Europe has not produced a pretty picture. And then he quotes from one of the German poets, Heinrich Heine, and I'll skip over that, but it's a very powerful quote from 1834, 100 years before the rise of Adolf Hitler. So it shows you that already in the 19th century, we saw the trajectory. But anyway, he finishes by saying that European Christians persecuted European Jews, often brutally, but it took post-Christian ideology, secular Nazism, to produce Auschwitz, just as it took post-Christian communism to produce the Gulag, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Ukrainian and Cambodian genocides. Moreover, Nazism and communism aside, the left's belief that secular reason can replace God in the Bible turns out to be completely wrong. The alleged citadels of modern reason and secular reason, the universities, are the most irrational and morally confused institutions in the West. And if you'd like to get some more on that, my commentary I might mention, Viewpoints commentary, where I talk about my quote from Dennis Prager saying the left ruins everything it touches is probably the case. So he concludes by saying, I don't know if a worker accident or a radical Muslim set fire to the Notre Dame Cathedral, as they have done so to scores of other churches around Europe. In terms of the fire represented, it doesn't much matter. What matters is the omen. Europe is burning, just as the cathedral was as well. And so that just kind of brings us to one other piece. And Nate Jackson, writing in the Patriot Post, put it this way. He said, Monday of Holy Week, and again, the significance of this is something that we certainly should note. But again, the Monday of Holy Week was a particularly poignant time for the Notre Dame Cathedral to burn. Fire destroyed the roof and the spire as well as much of the interior. It's difficult to see such magnificent Christian architecture going up in flames, yet no lives were lost, even with the building full of worshipers, workers, and tourists. Standing at the center of Paris, since the foundation stone was laid in 1163, this monumental Gothic cathedral took more than 100 years to finish, and it was perhaps the crowning achievement of an age when Christians prioritized enduring beauty to reflect the eternal glory of the Creator. To be sure, there were also other motivations for such grand enterprises, and external beauty does not cover internal rot, but building a place of worship meant to last for centuries is, sadly, a lost art. The first question on everyone's mind was whether Monday's fire was set deliberately, although authorities have said it was an accident amid a multi-million euro renovation. Already this year, however, vandals have attacked numerous Catholic churches across France, destroying various objects within them and harming the buildings, including by setting 2 of them on fire. According to the Daily Signal, in 2017 alone, the French government recorded 887 attacks on Christian artifacts or churches. It's unclear if any of these attacks have been attributed to Muslims, but given the rise of radical Islam in Europe, it's not unthinkable. France, where at least 1/8 of the population follows Islam, has the Western world's largest number of Muslims, and of course other deadly attacks in France have been perpetrated by radical Islamists. Yet far more important than the burning of Notre Dame is the metaphor it creates for the Western Christianity. Once the center of Christendom, Europe has descended over the last 2 centuries into a secular post-Christian and often anti-Christian malaise. Arguably, Europe was always more culturally Christian than doctrinally Christian, but now instead of the church being the center of society, government is. Nominal Christians have exchanged the truth of Scripture for the lies of self-worship. They've rejected God's authority, substituted their own feelings. To most of the French, the cathedral itself has become little more than a popular tourist attraction, and most of their mourning has nothing to do with losing a symbol of Christianity, but rather a cultural museum of national pride. Jesus himself might have called it a whitewashed tomb. Great line there. Finally, he says, the resulting vacuum in Europe is being filled by Islam, which aims to supplant Christianity and become the world's dominant religion. Europe is by far down the path and has begun to tread, but such Christianity hardly needs an external enemy when it's already committing suicide. The cathedral, then, is not just one cathedral up in flames, it's all of Western Christianity. Still, there is always hope. Christians and Christianity itself never find perfection in themselves. In fact, that's the point. Fallen humanity needs a Savior, and we celebrate his sacrifice and resurrection during this Holy Week. Indeed, that the Notre Dame cross survived the fire may just remind us that hope, renewal, and redemption remain by God's grace. After all, Christ promised that the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. Very good piece by Nate Jackson. And just again, a couple comments about what has been taking place, and we'll see how it is rebuilt. Of course, there are individuals all over the world that will be sending money in for the rebuilding of it, but I thought it was interesting that the National Review posted this piece that came out 2 years ago, which was entitled Panhandling for the Notre Dame Cathedral, because 2 years ago, it was kind of hard to raise money to just refurbish some of the things in there because the secular people, and of course France is very secular now, were asking, why should we spend our French tax dollars to refurbish a Catholic monument? And of course, your Muslims as well are going to say, why would we want to give money to something that is Catholic, not Muslim, or at least multicultural? But I think this time the devastation is so great and the interest worldwide is going to be so significant that we might see a rebuilding. But I don't think we're going to see anything like the great cathedral where the first stone, the foundation stone, was actually put down in the 12th century. It shows a little bit more about patience and endurance, and something that we certainly have lost here in the 21st century. We come back, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things happening in the political world. Mike Pence has finally responded to Pete Buttigieg, and we'll talk about some of the things he's been saying, and we'll also get into the whole attempt to defend some of the comments by Ilhan Omar. So a lot more to cover, and those are articles we've posted on the website. So go to the website, pointofview.net, to find out a little bit more. We'll be back right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that Rafael Cruz will be in studio in about a half an hour. And I thought I'd cover just a couple of issues in the news, but let me just mention that tomorrow is that Chick-fil-A Day that Jonathan Saenz has been talking about. He does that for a couple of reasons. Those of you in the state of Texas might really seriously think about going to the Capitol tomorrow, because the testimony on various legislation, which I think would provide protection to various organizations like Chick-fil-A. As a matter of fact, it's been called kind of the Chick-fil-A bill, but that's not what it's called, is being heard in committee. So he certainly has suggested that. But whether you can go to Austin or not, those of you in the state of Texas can at least go to txvalues.org and express your opinion on that issue to your legislator. And those of you that don't want to do so or are not in the state of Texas, at the very least, since tomorrow has been sort of designated as Chick-fil-A Day, it would be a good day to go to Chick-fil-A and say, I appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm sorry for all the controversy surrounding you, because we talked about how they were prohibited from having a restaurant in San Antonio. We'll see where that goes. I got a feeling before it's all through, they're going to get another vote and they will relent, like happened in Denver. Of course, you also have in the Buffalo airport, which is a little different because they weren't even going to consider them. It wasn't like they were in process to then be having their opportunity yanked, but it's still similar in that they were banned from that airport. But I didn't think it would get any crazier, but I was wrong. The unhinged left's war against Chick-fil-A now extends to hockey arenas. Have you seen this? This is just the craziest thing I have ever seen. Now, it turns out that, and let me just read you the news report first, and we'll get some commentary. A group of protesters took to the ice at the Cincinnati Cyclones hockey game on Saturday to slam Chick-fil-A over what they believe to be the company's anti-gay views. Wrong, but nevertheless, that's what they say. During the minor league playoff game against the Kalamazoo Wings. I love all these names. I've been to some minor league hockey games. They're a lot of fun. It's just very different than watching the Stars play the Preds right now. But anyway, the protesters unfurled signs reading Chick-fil-A is anti-gay while riding the Chick-fil-A sponsored Zamboni. Now, the Zamboni, if you're not familiar, that's what it does to, after each one of the periods, you have, of course, 3 periods, and during the breaks, of course, it then re-ices, makes it easier for the guys to skate on. And this Zamboni is called the Chick-fil-A Fan Zam. If you would like to see that, let me just show you sort of what it might look like. And there's a picture of these individuals, if you're watching online, that got on the Zamboni, which, right off the bat is criminal trespass, I would say, and commandeering that Zamboni to say that it's anti-gay. And then there's a video that you can watch as well. And so here is what indeed has taken place. To put it mildly, the Cincinnati Cyclones were not very happy. First of all, I'm not sure I want to make a hockey player mad. You know what I'm getting at here? That's just a possibility. But anyway, here's one of the responses. The hockey team, in the midst of a playoff series, has threatened 7 people with criminal trespassing if they ever return. The spokesperson said, signs will be banned on the Fan Zam Zamboni from now on. Moving forward, we've adopted a no signage policy on the Fan Zam, and we will be monitoring all riders to make sure this doesn't happen again. So, nevertheless, that is the case. And if you thought it couldn't get any crazier, I mean, you just, after a while, just have to say, look, I don't know what your problem is. This is perhaps one of the most successful fast food enterprises in the country. It's number 3 behind McDonald's and Starbucks, and it has never, ever been accused of not serving Chick-fil-A sandwiches to anybody of any ethnic background, any social, economic background, any sexual orientation or gender identity. And so then to get upset because some of the individuals that are part of the company have spoken out in tradition of traditional marriage, which, by the way, has been around longer than any of the protesters, to put it mildly, and longer than even the so-called gay movement has been around. But nevertheless, and because they also have the audacity to support, are you ready for this? Fellowship of Christian Athletes and the Salvation Army, which do so much good, which is in a contrast to these yahoos that were riding around on the Zamboni. But nevertheless, that's the way this game gets played these days. And so Chick-fil-A is not out there picking a fight. And even when they have people say nasty things about them, they really don't even respond in kind. They just simply go on about their business, successful as they are, doing very well, and certainly being blessed, because their benefit is tremendous. There was a statistic that Kelly Shackelford shared with us the other day, and I trust him where he got it, but I think it's pretty accurate that your typical fast food restaurant makes like $1,000 a day, and Chick-fil-A makes like $5,000 a day, something in that order. And the point he was making is that it does more on 6 days than the typical restaurant does in 7 days. And so there are just all sorts of things that show certainly a blessing to that organization. But while we're talking about the gay issue, I thought I'd also bring up this issue. It's the second article we've posted on the website here. And that is, if you have not been paying attention, an individual running for the presidency on the Democratic ticket, who is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and his name is Pete Buttigieg, or Buttigieg, depending on how you want to say it. He says Buttigieg, and his husband, since he's gay, calls it Buttigieg, but whatever, it's about the same. But nevertheless, he's been saying all sorts of things about Mike Pence. Mike Pence is a very gracious individual. He's been on the program with us many times before. As a matter of fact, he used to have a talk show, and some of us were on his talk show. So we've known him for literally decades. And I think he's been really patient until now. And this piece that we've posted here says Vice President Mike Pence fired back at Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg after the South Bend, Indiana mayor criticized him for his belief that homosexuality is a choice. Mike Pence said, he said some things that are critical of my Christian faith and about me personally, and he knows better, and he knows me, which I thought was interesting. But I get it. You know, it's look ahead. 19 people running for president on that side in a party that's sliding off to the left, and they're all competing with one another for how much more liberal they are. So, I appreciate the fact that the vice president is willing to say, look, first of all, he knows me. He knows that's not true. Second of all, I know why he's saying it, because he's trying to get some attention. And I'm, even by responding, giving him more attention than he deserves. But all right, that's the case. And, of course, the argument that he was having is that he was made by God to be gay. And so if the vice president has a problem with that, take it up with the Creator. But the vice president added, I have my Christian values. My family and I have a view of marriage that's informed by my faith, and we stand by that. But that doesn't mean we're critical of anyone else who has a different point of view. And again, just a good illustration of that. And I think that one of the better pieces I saw surfacing recently was our piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in which it said, Mayor Pete and tolerance, attacking Mike Pence is better politics than defending pluralism. Pete Buttigieg, they say, is the flavor of the month on the Democratic politics. And on Sunday, the mayor formally launched his 2020 bid. In a kickoff speech, he again reflected on his teenage fears that being gay meant that he'd never wear the uniform, never accept it, never know love. But when he was deployed to Afghanistan with the Navy Reserve, his fellow service soldiers and others did not treat him differently. They cared for my M4. They cared if my M4 was locked and loaded, not whether I was going to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And so he talks about that. But then he says, how can you live that story and not believe that America deserves our optimism, deserves our courage, and deserves our hope? He could have stopped right there, because if nothing else, he could have said, you know, only in America would be somebody like me, given the fact that in many ways I'm a little bit outside the mainstream. I was able to become the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and I was able to actually now run for the presidency. Could have stopped right there. But, of course, he didn't. And then, of course, he goes into criticism of Mike Pence. And, of course, when those issues were surfaced in the past, even back when he came out in gay in 2015, they point out that Then Governor of Indiana, Mike Pence, said, I hold Mayor Buttigieg in the highest personal regard. I see him as a dedicated public servant and patriot. And he even referred last week to him as a friend. So I come back to the subtitle of this editorial from the Wall Street Journal. Yes, you know, when you're running on the Democratic side, it's just easier to attack the Vice President, Mike Pence, than it is to defend pluralism and talk about the greatness of America. I think if you want to have somebody that's optimistic about the future, Pete Buttigieg says that he is, but I think Mike Pence shows that he really is. Let's take a break. We've got a little bit more to cover. Lots of controversy surrounding those trying to defend Ilhan Omar, so we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention again, Rafael Cruz will be in studio with us. And if you have a comment or a question, certainly I know he would love to respond to some of your comments. But let me take on one other issue. And it's one of those issues which, again, is troubling to me in the fact that, as you may know, and we have only mentioned it here, but you probably have heard this on other shows, that Ilhan Omar, who is a member of Congress from Minnesota, who obviously is Muslim, as you already probably know as well, had made some comments that were a little bit troubling. And again, I'm willing to cut anybody some slack. Sometimes when you get up and you're speaking, you're doing live radio, there are some mistakes that you can sometimes make. You can maybe misidentify an individual. You can maybe downplay the significance of something that is very significant. And so I didn't make a big deal about it until not only did the freshman in the House of Representatives, but all of her fellow Democrats, including some of her fellow progressives, instead of saying, yeah, that probably wasn't the best thing to say, went and doubled down on it and started attacking and criticizing anybody that pointed out the error of her ways. And then now has even suggested that because they were critical of some of the things she said, that this has put her life in jeopardy. Interesting enough, somebody pointed out the other day that one of those individuals that was complaining about putting somebody that this might be a threat to Ilhan Omar was the same individual that said when he saw that young boy from Kentucky with the MAGA hat, remember him? Said, isn't that a face you'd love to punch? So here he's got one tweet where he's really sort of calling on people to punch out the young boy from Kentucky. With the MAGA hat, if you remember, in Washington, D.C., standing there quietly when an individual who was a Native American was sort of confronting him, and on the other hand was complaining about this. But again, that's the way tribalism works. But in case you're not familiar, last month at a message in front of the Council on American Islamic Relations, she said, for far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen. So the argument is, well, I'm a victim because I'm a Muslim. Frankly, I'm tired of it, she says, and every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. Then she goes on to say CARE, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations, was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Okay, where do you start? First of all, CARE was not founded after 9/11. I think most people probably know that by now. And some people did something, well, that's kind of called the 9/11 controversy and the attack on our soil. As David French in the piece that we've posted here said, to minimize the gravity of the deadliest foreign attack on U.S. soil, at least since the British Army burned Washington in the War of 1812, was a bit much. And so again, this would probably have faded away if it weren't for the fact that she's also talked about the fact that Israel has been hypnotizing the world, a claim that support for Israel is all about the Benjamins. Remember that one? Benjamins be $100 bills. The idea that our support of Israel means that we have an allegiance to a foreign country, and on and on and on and on, the things that she said. And the point I'm making, and the point that David French is making, is, first of all, there is a real striking difference because he talks about Steve King. Steve King's been on the program in the past. He's from Iowa, but he made some very unfortunate, that's a nice word to say it, but some disturbing comments on a radio interview. And that was enough for the Republican leadership to strip him of his committee chairmanship. And maybe and we can have a debate someday about whether or not that was appropriate or not. But the point is that when an individual makes some really significant gaffe, oftentimes there is a call for that person to resign, a call for that person to at least apologize, a call for that individual to be stripped of their committee chairmanship. And the argument that David French is making is a good one because his argument was that was justified. But what do you do in this particular case? And then if it didn't get a little more confusing, Dan Crenshaw, who is from the 2nd District here in the state of Texas, Louis Gohmert's in the 1st Congressional District, Dan Crenshaw's in the 2nd Congressional District, and of course Van Taylor's on every week, is from the 3rd Congressional District. But Dan Crenshaw, who lost an eye when he served his military in his military time, actually said that the comments and criticism was unbelievable. And, of course, at that point, you knew that Donald Trump was going to weigh in, and David French spent some time kind of being critical of some of the things that were said by Donald Trump and his tweet. But the point is that then the reaction to Dan Crenshaw, not to mention the reaction to, of course, Donald Trump, was been to then attack them. And so we see just kind of this whole situation, which is illustrated really by the title of his commentary. To defend Ilhan Omar, Democrats use identity politics as a shield. And this idea of identity politics seems to suggest that if indeed you are a woman, you are a Muslim, you're a homosexual, you are African American, Hispanic, that is enough to shield you from any criticism, and any criticism that you engage in the case of Ilhan Omar, is by definition Islamophobic. Any criticism that takes place, for example, of Pete Buttigieg will be considered to be, well, homophobic. Any criticism of Kamala Harris could be considered to be racist, and on and on and on. And so the point he's making is that this is the way in which some of these individuals continually are protected by some of these ideas. And as a result, there's never a willingness to say, okay, maybe I just misspoke. Maybe I need to come back and say that with a little more precision. Or maybe if I've said something that would be offensive to some of you, I need to apologize. But you're just not going to see that. Which brings me to another point that I've made on this program many times before. During this Democrat primary, I predict, and I am been still dedicated to predicting it, although I think I'm the minority here, that the so-called woke primary that we have right now is simply not going to allow a white male to get the nomination. Now, right now, everybody that sits around the table with me disagrees, and they may be right and I may be wrong, because they're saying, well, look at who's leading right now. It's either Joe Biden, or it's Bernie Sanders, or it might be Beto O'Rourke. And one thing all three of them have in common is they're white males. As a matter of fact, two of them are pretty old, because this age issue, I think, is going to be another issue, which I talked about yesterday in terms of the president. But the only way to, in a sense, shield those individuals from some of the criticism and to hopefully blunt what might be said by the president is to have somebody who is Hispanic, and that'd be Julian Castro. Somebody is African American, that'd be Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, somebody like that. Or maybe somebody, in the case of a white male, but at least is homosexual, Pete Buttigieg. So we'll see where that goes. But nevertheless, I wanted to post this article. It's the first article there defending Ilhan Omar. And it's just a reminder again that we live in a very different world where just not so long ago, if somebody misspoke or said something that was really offensive to a lot of people, not to mention the people that lost individuals, friends, neighbors, coworkers who died on 9/11, or others who have had family members who have gone to fight the war on terrorism have died, those kind of comments get to be a little bit offensive. But instead of saying, okay, I probably didn't say that the right way, I apologize, instead to double down and then start criticizing anybody that raises the question in the first place, shows us the invalid, kind of the inverse world that we find ourselves in today, and how in many cases they try to just invalidate any of the criticism and comments being made. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to focus our time and attention on socialism, on what is happening on our country, the need for pastors to speak out, and really why America is still the greatest nation in the world. We'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time talking once again about socialism, but also the need for Christians to apply biblical principles to every area of life. And we have in studio with us Rafael Cruz. You might say, why? Well, we just recently did a whole series on socialism, a clear and present danger. And I thought it would be good to have at least one more opportunity to look at what socialism really is, because we find, as we have done lots of surveys, that young people tend to think that socialism might be a good idea. So let's hear from some individuals that lived through it. Now, of course, just a couple of weeks ago, we had Dinesh D'Souza and his wife, Debbie D'Souza. She was, of course, born in Caracas, Venezuela. She can talk about Hugo Chavez. But Rafael Cruz can certainly talk about this as well. He was born in Cuba, lived and suffered under a very cruel and oppressive dictator. And then in 1957, I had a student visa to come to this country, and it's an incredible story. We're going to talk about that. And, of course, today is not only a minister, but the head and the director of Grace for America, and travels all over the place to various churches and Christian organizations to give the gospel and to really remind people about how to apply biblical principles to this area of government. So, Rafael Cruz, it's just great to have you back in studio.
Kerby, it's so great to be with you again.
Let's, if we can, tell a little bit more of your story. I left it out because I'd rather you tell the story, but there was a leader coming into your country that was promising hope and change. It didn't turn out so well, did it?
Well, as a matter of fact, you know, that I was just 13 years old when this charismatic leader rose up after Batista had taken power, and with a group of young university students attack an army garrison. Most of those kids were put in jail, but or killed, actually. But Castro and his brother were put in jail. And he just appeared to be just a political revolutionary, someone talking about freedom, and we were mesmerized as kids. I was a high school kid, and Castro was sent to exile. But meanwhile, the revolution started in the high schools and the universities. Started with student protests, which were quickly met by billy clubs. And then pretty soon that became civic resistance, like the resistance movement in France during the Second World War. And I became part of that revolution, that civic resistance, and still thinking that Castro was a freedom fighter, because that's what he portrayed to us. And as a result of that involvement, I found myself imprisoned and tortured.
Yes, I knew you were.
But, you know, by the grace of God, that God that I did not know, he had other purposes for me. As a matter of fact, I could think of 3 or 4 occasions in which I should have been killed.
Wow.
But God had other purposes for my life. And so after I was released from prison, and that was a miracle in itself, because that never happened. Typically, when they capture somebody, they would kill them after a few days, put a pistol in their hands, and just say, oh, they tried to attack an army patrol and were killed in self-defense. So in my case, they decided to let me go and follow me to see who I would contact. And so I had no choice but to leave the country. I could not expose my parents and my sister to their being attacked because of me. So the easiest way to come to the United States was on a student visa. I had been a straight A student in high school, so I applied to 3 universities in the United States. University of Texas was the first one to accept me. Yes. That's how I became a Texan.
Well, and again, I know you got a job as a dishwasher and had a little bit of money tucked into your undergarments, and that was how you got started. But you've been an all-American success story when you came here.
Well, it's just the hand of God. As I said, that God that I didn't know. I started as a dishwasher, and as soon as I could learn enough English, I became a cook.
Yes.
And worked as a cook all through my undergraduate. But, there were so many miracles. I remember getting to the University of Texas, and without even applying for it, I was offered what was called a Good Neighbor Scholarship.
Wow.
That paid my tuition all through the university. Now, tuition for foreign students at that time was $200 a semester. That seemed like $1 million to me.
Oh, sure.
But, God made a way. And as I said, I just think in awe as to the grace of God.
Yeah.
Because I had no concept of who God was.
Yeah.
But it is overwhelming how God just led me in those steps towards Him,
Yes. Well, and I thought we might talk about that. Of course, many people know your son because he's a United States Senator, but I thought it was interesting that most people don't know that you have a great conversion story about becoming a Christian after becoming very successful, as a matter of fact, in the business world.
Well, yes, I became very successful in the oil and gas exploration. After 7 years out of college, I had my own oil and gas exploration company, became a multimillionaire. But in the process became a drunk.
Yes.
And I mean, I would leave work and go to a bar till 1 o'clock in the morning and then drag myself home. And I'll tell you, it was pretty scary getting up in the morning and not knowing how you got home.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point that it practically destroyed my family. I left my wife and son when he was 3 years old, came to Houston, drowning myself in a bottle of booze. And in the middle of that, a man who had sold me a computer were those big, humongous things, invited me to a Bible study at his home. Well, I didn't have anything to do. I didn't know anybody, so I went. Kerby, I couldn't tell you what the Bible study was about. What impressed me was what happened after the Bible study. They had what was called a time of prayer, and they asked for prayer requests. And what shocked me is all these people had problems. As a matter of fact, there was a lady that lived with her son, and her son would beat her to get money for drugs.
Wow.
And yet she had a peace that I couldn't understand. They all did. It's something that the Bible calls a peace that surpasses all understanding.
Yeah, Philippians. Yeah.
They all had it,
yes.
And I certainly didn't. Anyway, when we... at the end of the evening, the lady of the house gave me a little booklet, and she said, would you take it home and read it? It was the 4 Spiritual Laws.
4 Spiritual Laws, yes.
And she said, would you come next Monday? So I went the next Monday, and the first thing she said is, did you read the booklet? Yes. What did you think of it? And I said, oh, that's too easy. It can't be that easy. Well, she was a new Christian. She didn't know how to answer. And instead of referring me to the man who led the Bible study, she just said, look, our pastor is coming to our house tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Why don't you come? So I did. And I thought, this hick pastor, what is he going to convince me of? I'm a scientist. I got all the answers. I spent 4 hours arguing with this pastor. Praise God for the endurance of this pastor. I argued with him until 11 o'clock at night.
We'll take a break and hear the rest of the story right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democrats in the House of Representatives are moving a bill that would more than double the nationwide minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's all part of the campaign to fight for 15 that may be doing more harm than good. I've documented in previous commentaries that there will be winners and losers. The winners are those who receive the bump in pay. The losers are those who receive a pink slip or aren't even hired in the first place. The editors at the Wall Street Journal noticed what is happening in New York City when the minimum wage rose again on December 31st. Businesses with 11 or more workers must pay $15 an hour. They wonder if it is mere coincidence that the city's full-service restaurants have fallen into a jobs recession. Employment in January dropped more than 3%, and it appears like it dropped a little bit more in February. The New York City Hospitality Alliance surveyed hundreds of eateries last year and found that nearly half planned to eliminate jobs in 2019 due to higher labor costs. 3/4 plan to cut employee hours. The editors also point to a research paper that raises a question that never occurred to me. The Economist found robust evidence that minimum wage hikes increase property crime arrest among teenagers and young adults ages 16 to 24, a population for whom minimum wages are likely to bind. The Economist provides some sobering estimates about the possible increased costs due to property crimes. The current bill in Congress makes no adjustment for the cost of living, so the editors conclude that a cashier in New York, Texas, population 9, cannot be paid a dime less than the $15 an hour due in New York City. If passed, this bill could do significant harm. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with me today, Rafael Cruz, and we had one of those cliffhangers. So we were talking about this pastor, and I guess we need to get you saved here because you were arguing for hours with this pastor, and tell us the rest of the story.
Well, Kerby, I'll tell you, I love Brother Wiley with a passion. You know,
yes.
This man had so much endurance. I spent 4 hours arguing with this man. I had all the answers.
Yeah, you thought you did.
I remember 11 o'clock at night, after 4 hours of arguing, the last question Brother Wiley asked me. The last question I asked him. I said, well, let me ask you a question. What about that man up in the mountains of Tibet who's never heard of Jesus? Well, very wisely, Brother Galen Wiley didn't go chasing that rabbit.
Yeah.
He looked me in the eye and he said, well, to tell you the truth, I don't know about that man up in the mountains of Tibet who's never heard of Jesus, but you've heard of Jesus. What's your excuse?
Yes, great line.
That question just hit me like a sledgehammer. All of a sudden, it was like scales dropped from my eyes. And I saw in my spirit the reality of Jesus Christ, and I dropped to my knees and surrendered my life to Christ.
Yes.
And it was glorious. Next thing I did after that, I got on a plane, went back to my wife and son, and tried to explain to my wife what had happened. Well, she didn't believe me. She didn't understand it. But she also didn't want to raise a child without a father.
Right.
So she decided to give me another chance. Now, to celebrate, we go to Acapulco.
Mm.
And we're sitting on the beach, and I'm drinking a beer, and I drank a beer, and I ordered a second beer. Had drank half of it. All of a sudden, I take a sip of that beer. It was the most horrible, bitter taste I've ever tasted in my life. That was the last sip of beer I ever had in my life.
Wow,
I mean,
that story.
God took the taste of it, and with it, I took the desire of it. I got home, I had this bar with every conceivable bottle of booze. I poured them all down the drain. The garbage man must have thought I had the wildest party because I had a garbage can full of empty booze bottles.
Yeah, that's a great story. But again, one of the reasons we want to have you on is because you have lived through socialism. You have really tried to warn people in this country, and you've been invited into church after church. Matter of fact, we have a link here, so if people want to connect you up with you, they can do so. But you've been concerned, as I have. One of the reasons I wrote this book on capitalism and socialism, of course, it's part of some of these economics books I've written as well, both in English and in Spanish, because, I see how important that is to reach out to the Spanish world as you do as well. But I know you're concerned about a whole generation of young people today that say, socialism isn't so bad. What would you say to them?
Well, the Bible says in Hosea 4:6, my people perish for lack of knowledge. I like the way Thomas Jefferson rephrased Hosea 4:6. Thomas Jefferson said, if a people expect to be ignorant and free, they expect what never was and never will be.
Yes.
People that think that socialism is great, all they have to do is listen to what George Santayana said. If we do not learn the lessons of history, we're doomed to repeat them. Look around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Before Castro, Cuba had the highest per capita income in all of Latin America. The only country in Latin America, except for Panama, which had a dollar economy, that had a 1-to-1 exchange with the U.S. dollar. Very strong economy. Cuba produced 10 million tons of sugar a year. Number one producer of sugar in the world.
Yes.
Today, 60 years later, Cuba produces 1 million tons of sugar. 10% of what they produced 60 years ago. Today in Cuba, the average salary is between $20 to $30 a month.
Yes.
And you said you had Debbie D'Souza. She knows it very well. Before, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America with so much oil and booming economy. Today, people are going through garbage cans in Venezuela looking for something to eat. Communism doesn't work. And as a matter of fact, even in America, when those very committed Christians landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, that very first year in Plymouth Plantation, they said, look, we have all this land before us. Why don't we all work the land together and let us share equally in what the land produces? Sounds very romantic, doesn't it? Well, that experiment was a total failure. And you can see why it would be a failure. Because maybe you're too strong, very strong, and you can plow 10 hours a day, but I'm not so strong, and maybe I could only plow 2 hours a day. How long do you think you were going to plow 10 hours a day while I do 2, and we get paid the same? Not very long.
That's right.
So nobody worked. As a matter of fact, half those people died that first year.
That's right.
But they were smart enough and flexible enough that at the end of that first year, they came before Governor Bradford. And they said, Governor Bradford, this didn't work. So the governor said, all right, each of you take your own plot of land, you work the land, you feed your family. And the free enterprise system was born in America after that first year of our existence. And that has made America freedom and free enterprise, has created the American dream that with hard work and perseverance, anyone can achieve their wildest dreams, and has made America the most prosperous country in the world, and a country that has been able to export those ideas and bring a lot of countries out of poverty into prosperity. And along with that, Kerby, I love this country with a passion.
Yes.
The second thing, and probably the most important thing, as I said before, those people that came on the Mayflower, deeply committed Christians. They were fleeing religious persecution. And before they got off the boat, they penned a document called the Mayflower Compact, which starts by stating their purpose. for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. What a glorious statement. And then it said, in the presence of God, we covenant and combine ourselves together to form a civic body politic. In other words, some form of government. Why? For our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. What are the ends aforesaid? The glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. What a glorious heritage we have in America. America, this 4% of the population of the world, has been responsible for over 80% of the evangelism of the world.
That's right.
And God has used America to share the message of Jesus Christ throughout the world and the message of free enterprise and freedom.
One of the reasons we do a lot about America's godly heritage is so that this next generation can learn about that, because they don't know who William Bradford is. They don't know about the experiment at the Plymouth plantation, or even the same experiment they had in Jamestown, because that didn't work there as well. And they said, well, you work 1 month for the common stores, but the others for yourself. That's a tax rate that's a whole lot lower than a lot of people paid just recently here. So again, an illustration. And again, the Mayflower Compact. I had a professor at Georgetown that made the argument, and he wasn't the kind of person that could sign your doctrinal statement of your church, that it really was the first constitution. So when we come back, we want to spend some time getting into this, and I want to get you to talk about this because you've spent some time talking to some of these college students. And when they say, I like socialism, you're smart enough to say, well, how do you define socialism? And you found that they don't define it accurately. So that is one of those ideas that we want to get into. And again, if you haven't already picked up some of the resources we've made available, we've posted some of those on our website. But again, this one on capitalism and socialism. Before we're through, I want to hear from you about the Patriot Preachers, because we just sort of got into that, or constitutional interpretation, or many of the others. So if you'd like to join the conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Rafael Cruz in studio with us today. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about Grace for America, or about him, or perhaps even have him come to speak in your church or in your community, I think you would benefit tremendously from that. And sometimes we need somebody who was not born in America, who understands our history, to talk to us about that. And certainly that is some reason why we wanted to bring Rafael Cruz in studio today. But also, as we've talked about this issue of socialism, we have that banner, which is still up. It says, Socialism, Clear and Present Danger. If you click on that button, you can join the team, because we really do want you to support this ministry. And for as little as $1 a day or $30 a month, $360 a year, you can support this ministry. But even if you'd like to send a one-time gift and say, I appreciate the things that I hear on Point of View, we would certainly love to hear from you. Let's take a break, though. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Rafael Cruz in studio with us today, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Rafael Cruz with us in studio. We've been talking about everything from his testimony and the history of this nation, as well as we'll get into socialism. Since you mentioned the Mayflower, I thought I'd take this call real quickly. We'll go to Indiana. Larry, thank you for calling today. You're on with Rafael Cruz.
Hello, Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Hello. Thank you very much, Mr. Cruz, for doing what you're doing. My 11th great-grandfather was Elder William Brewster.
Wow.
And,
William Brewster. Yes.
Yeah. And he's spot on with all these observations in reference to our nation's history. Through written and verbal history, my family has carried this down. And he's exactly right. There were only 4 adult women that survived that first winter as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And one of them was Mary Brewster. And ever since then, the relatives of my family were on the Mayflower, signed the Declaration of Independence. Relatives that were there for the convention, Constitutional Convention, and signed that, fought in every war through myself in Vietnam.
Well, praise God for that heritage of liberty and patriotism that you have carried in all your lineage. I'll tell you what, your whole family, they are American heroes, and we salute you.
Well, thank you very much. But I salute you for keeping this alive, because we should not cast history into history.
Well, isn't it sad that there are so many people that are trying to erase history?
Yes.
Yes,
rewrite it. Yeah.
We see it in our universities all the time.
Yes, and they first attacked our universities in the early 1900s, and we must remember too, the first universities and first colleges in the United States were Catholic.
Well, they were all teaching the Word of God. As a matter of fact, they were all, it was the first Bible in America was printed under the auspices of Congress to be the principal textbook in every primary school, high school, and university across the country. And that was so until 1963, when the Supreme Court banned the Bible from all public schools.
Yes.
Over 150 years of the Bible being taught in every school in America. So much for separation of church and state, isn't it?
Well, and again, this gets us back to something else, because I really want to encourage some of our Christian kids to go and get a degree in history and teach the true history, because, first of all, a lot of history has been ignored, as you well know, and then a fair amount of it has been kind of revised in a way. And so, one of the reasons we bring on, you and I were talking about David Barton off air, but certainly Jerry Newcomb and a variety of other individuals that have written on this whole area of history, because it's just so important that we pass this lineage on to the next generation, because our children and grandchildren didn't study the things that you studied when you became a citizen, didn't study the things I did when I was both in school and even in graduate school, and we need to pass that on to the next generation, don't we?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, speaking of the university, I want to come back to this, because we've been talking about socialism in part in previous programs, and you found that when you ask a typical college student to define socialism, you don't necessarily get the right answer. Explain that.
As a matter of fact, the answer that I am always given by these kids, and it seems like it is like a pat answer.
Yes.
And they say socialism is the control of the means of production by the people. And I tell them, oh, no. The people have no say whatsoever. Socialism is the control of the means of production by almighty government. Not different than when Karl Marx talked about communism, about the dictatorship of the proletariat. The people, the proletariat, had no say-so. It was the dictators that control everything. The people have absolutely no say. And one of the things that is so sad, we were talking earlier about the American dream.
Right.
Socialism teaches dependency upon government. Government is the big daddy that is going to give you everything, so you just sit back and take the handouts. Kerby, I think the saddest thing about the dependent society is it kills the dream. It destroys the dream. And the Bible clearly tells us, without a vision, people perish.
Yes.
If you don't have a dream, if you don't have a vision, then you conform yourself with mediocrity. But God created us to excel in whatever we do. The word of God tells us in Colossians chapter 3, whatsoever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men. Excel in everything you have. Achieve your wildest dreams, because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. And socialism kills that desire to excel, and it just creates mediocrity.
Yes. And when you go to these countries, whether it was communist countries behind the Iron Curtain, you and I are old enough to remember that. Some of our younger listeners are not. Or even if you go today to Cuba, you go to Venezuela, there's a drabness, there's a sadness, because there's no dream that you can have, because it has been taken away from you by individuals that say, there, I know a lot more about what you need than what you actually know. And yet the best person to make decisions about my future is me.
Absolutely.
But when that's taken away by the government, you don't have any opportunity even to pursue your own dreams or to pursue what God has called you to do, because that's one of the reasons why in most of these countries religious liberty is not free, because the government cannot have someone else that has a higher allegiance than the government, right?
And that is why socialism and atheism go together.
Yes.
Because socialism, and by the way, to those who are listening, socialism and communism are absolutely the same. It's only a matter of degrees. Mm-hmm. Socialism always leads to totalitarianism, where total control is in the hands of just a few people. And, Lord Acton said many years ago, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So socialism is just a soft form of communism that degenerates into full and total totalitarianism, where men become slaves of the government.
Yes.
And it is just sad that, especially for kids that cherish freedom.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, what your teenage kids fought so much? I want my freedom. I don't want you to tell me what to do. And so these same kids are in universities now wanting to have the government to dictate every aspect of their lives. One of my favorite scriptures is Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has set you free, and do not entangle yourselves again with the yoke of bondage. Mm-hmm. Why would we self-impose ourselves with a yoke of bondage? That's what we're doing when we embrace socialism.
One of the things I've said in one of my commentaries is that if you're around young people, and I speak at youth camps all the time, they always say, I'm so tired of my parents telling me what to do. And so I'll oftentimes ask them, well, what are you going to do when you graduate from high school? I'm going to join the Marines. You have no idea what you just said. You're going to have people telling you what to do all the time. But that's the same thing with socialism. You have the whole millennial generation, so-called Generation Y, and then now the Generation Z, iGen generation, these two, Generation Y, Generation Z. If there's one thing they always say is, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. But then they embrace socialism, where the government tells you what to do from start to finish, from
Absolutely.
Morning to night.
Absolutely.
Right?
And you notice how this starts. It starts with class warfare.
There you go.
You divide everybody into a series of groups. You make each group seem like a victim. I think the worst thing that President Obama said in his 8 years was, you didn't build that. Mm-hmm. Because that basically says you can't make it on your own. You need the handout of government. And that destroys that incentive, that dream. And so people become dependent upon government. And the more they become dependent upon government, the more control government takes. And I'm sure you read 1984.
That's right.
George Orwell.
Yes.
Big Brother is watching you. Well,
Yes.
Big Brother is watching us more and more and more every day. And we do not need more government. We need less government. As a matter of fact, another quote from Jefferson. Jefferson is my favorite of the framers. And he said, the Constitution is like chains to bind the mischief of government.
Right. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Rafael Cruz. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Also want to get his thoughts about some of these ideas being proposed by candidates. I'd love to see if he ever anticipated that we'd have so many people arguing for what is called democratic socialism. We'll talk about that with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes in studio with us today, Rafael Cruz. And again, if you want to know more about him, of course, you can visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a few calls just because I know some of you would like to weigh in with your comments. So let's head out to Nevada. Whitney, is it Whitey? Go ahead. Thank you for calling.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Rafael Cruz.
Good morning.
Dios bendiga a ti y tu familia.
Muy bien, gracias.
De nada. By the way, you were talking about the difference between the socialists and the communists. First of all, point number one, the communists have killed tens of millions of people in China and in Russia. Mm-hmm. Don't forget that. And number two, the difference between communists and socialists is very simple. You give the guns to the socialists, you become a communist. You take the guns away from the communists, you become socialist.
Yeah. Good line.
That is great.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, and again, that's the thing. Sometimes people say, well, there's a difference between socialism and communism, or you hear this idea of democratic socialism. And some people have tried to say, well, Sweden is a socialist country. First of all, I did a commentary recently where even a historian in Sweden says, we're not socialist. Matter of fact, when we were, we nearly destroyed the economy. And even to this day, boy, it's the old line that socialism only works as long as you don't run out of somebody else's money, because it is very expensive to live in some of those countries.
That's what Margaret Thatcher said, didn't it?
Yes. So again, that's one of those ideas. Let me take one more phone call real quickly. We'll go to Texas this time, since we do have a Texan here. And Susan, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, I was reading a Dr. David Noble, and he was describing socialism just like you are, that it deteriorates into communism always and totalitarianism. And he said that when Karl Marx and his atheist friend lawyer were sitting around thinking about how to prevent poverty, living on his father's textile industry money.
Yes. The ironies are great. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that he said what socialism does is that it takes from those according to their ability and gives to those according to their need. And that's where the control comes in. If they think you'll be a good engineer, that is what you're going to be, whether you want to be or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also it's the idea that, well, once we liberate people from capitalism, then we'll produce all these goods. But I remember when Boris Yeltsin came to this country, and he was getting a tour of NASA, and then afterwards, for some reason, he said he wanted to go to a grocery store, and he went into this grocery store, and he was overwhelmed because he looked around at all of the food and all of the fresh items, and he said, we have nothing like this in Russia. Even those in the Politburo do not live as well as a typical person in Houston. And he realized, again, just the fact that they had pursued the wrong economic model.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just the fact that the reason, very simple reason why communism doesn't work is because your rewards are not tied to your efforts.
That's right.
So there is no incentive to put any effort. And so what happens with any country that implements socialism is the economy collapses very quickly because nobody works.
Right.
There's no incentive to work.
Well, and then again, when you have these individuals trying to control all these numerous interactions, and I talk about this in some of the books on capitalism and the free enterprise system, the market is a much better determiner of what is supply and demand. But you, in the old Soviet Union, would go to some places where they would have lots of clocks, but they wouldn't have toothbrushes. And you go into another town, they have lots of toothbrushes, but no clocks, because you just don't, there's nobody bright enough, or certainly is nobody altruistic enough, because I believe in human sinfulness, as you do as well, to make all those independent decisions. And so if you've ever even been on a committee, and of course, you and I have been involved in politics for many years, and you see trying to make a decision by committee or trying to get a party platform, you just realize those are small issues compared to the complexity of the 21st century economy. And somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders, who thinks that just a few smart bureaucrats in Washington can make the right decisions for you, it's ludicrous, isn't it?
Well, you know, I was laughing when Bernie Sanders first came up with the idea of taxing the rich at 90%. And my response was, Bernie, why not tax the rich at 100%? Let's confiscate all the money of the rich. And let's take a very liberal definition of the rich. Let's say anybody with $1 million or more is the rich.
Right.
Let's confiscate all their money. If you did that, you could run America for 1 year. What are you going to do next year? The rich don't have any more money. You can't tax them anything. They can't produce jobs. America would go bankrupt in 1 year. That's
Yes.
how crazy that is.
It is so crazy. One of the other things I wanted to hear from you is we've talked about the need for preachers, and I know you've been really encouraging our pastors, and I know we have a lot of listeners right now that are pastors, Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, and I know that you can be invited into churches to speak on that, but what would you say? Because we're coming into an election season, it seems to me we need to educate some people from biblical perspectives, don't we?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to understand what the Bible says, and we need to understand why pastors have been hiding behind the pulpit and using biblical excuses which don't hold up. But to do that, let's start with a little bit of history. You know, most people think that the American Revolution started in the 1770s, but it really started in the 1730s with men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and others that you may not have heard of, like Harry Hoosier. Harry Hoosier was a black evangelist from Indiana. As a matter of fact, most people in Indiana don't know that's why they're called Hoosiers.
Yeah.
Because of Harry Hoosier. Harry Hoosier was a black evangelist at the end of the 1700s. He was called the best orator in America. Great man of God. And anyway, it was this man of God that actually created the spark that ignited the American Revolution. The American Revolution started in the churches. You look at the Declaration of Independence, 19 grievances against King George. But actually, those ideas didn't come from Jefferson. Those 19 grievances had been preached in the churches for 10 years. It was the pastors calling out King George for the atrocities that the British were imposing upon the American people. My friend David Barton says you could consider the Declaration as a series of sermon summaries.
Yes.
It was pastors that were at the forefront of confronting the political establishment for the oppression upon the American people. The question that begs an answer, where are those pastors today? They're hiding behind their pulpits. And you know, just a couple of tidbits on American history. We know that the first battle for our independence was the Battle of Lexington. But the Battle of Lexington was fought outright of the church of Pastor Jonas Clark, the pastor where Paul Revere was going to warn him.
That's right.
And at that battle, 8 colonists died. 7 of those were members of Pastor Jonas Clark's church because the pastor and all the men of the congregation were at the forefront of that battle. Battle after battle after battle, Christians, pastors were at the forefront of those battles. Where are those pastors today, Kerby?
I don't know. One of the things I always like to mention is we got this Patriot Preachers, and you can read about Jonas Clark in there as well as in some of the other material. And if you want to contact Rafael Cruz, we've made it possible for him to be contacted as well. And I appreciate you giving us an hour today, and thank you for coming into Point of View.
Well, thank you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some other issues, but I think you would really enjoy contacting him, and you'll find more information on our website, pointofview.net.
This Easter, from 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment comes Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. When Joy Smith's son John falls through an icy Missouri lake, all hope seems lost. But a mother's belief in the power of prayer inspires her community to trust God to do the impossible.
Please, God, send your Holy Spirit to save my son.
Breakthrough, rated PG, parental guidance suggested. In theaters Wednesday, April 17th. Tickets and showtimes available at breakthroughmovie.com.
Ronald Reagan.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
What are you doing to pass on truth and freedom? As one step, have you joined Point of View Radio's Truth Team? If not, why not? Join today. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, one of the things we talk about here on Point of View is how to articulate a biblical worldview, but also to know how to defend a biblical worldview. That idea of defending a biblical worldview is known as apologetics. And so many times when we've talked about apologetics, we've talked about things that are kind of left brain, linear, things like the evidence for the existence of God, or various kinds of evidence for and documentation of the reliability of the Bible. And as important as that is, one of the things we've also started talking about here on Point of View is what I call cultural apologetics. Not only looking at things like truth, but beauty, and really beginning to understand how to begin to use things in our culture to defend a biblical perspective and maybe even draw people to God. And so that's one of the things we're going to do this hour with an individual who's been on the program with us many times before. Dr. Douglas Groothuis is an individual who is, of course, a professor at Denver Seminary, individual that is so well known for being the author of course, his seminal book, Christian Apologetics, as well as books on such issues as postmodernism, his book Truth Decay, a whole series of books dealing with evaluating the New Age movement, and on, just a tremendous number of resources that he has made available. But we're going to kind of focus on something that you're going to find a little more interesting. If you go to our website, you're going to see an article that he recently published on how jazz can shape apologetics. Then I even went back to allaboutjazz.com on how to listen to jazz. And I think you're going to find this fascinating because it's just a different kind of way to look at this whole area of apologetics. So Doug Groothuis joins us by phone. And Doug, how are you doing today?
Kerby, good to be on again.
You know, last time we were talking with you, of course, another book that you've published was about your wife, who, of course, is no longer living. You're remarried. I might mention that to those of us that follow that on Facebook, have rejoiced in your marriage, and this has been just kind of a new chapter in your life, hasn't it?
Well, it has. Ecclesiastes says it's time to mourn and it's time to dance. And Becky and I had a long season of mourning through her dementia. And she passed away last year in July. And for me and my new wife, Kathleen, it's the dance for a time of joy and having a wonderful marriage where we do a lot of things together. We went to a Dave Barry event about his new book about his dog, Lucy. We just had a great time. And so we need to know what time it is, as Ecclesiastes says. There is a time to mourn and before the face of God and try to find meaning in that. And then there are other seasons that are lighter, that are joyful. And that's the season that Kathleen and I find ourselves in now. It's wonderful.
Let me just see if we can get a better line with you for the moment. And while we are doing that, my best would be to maybe just talk a little bit about this, because one of the things that you've written about is how jazz can shape apologetics. And you even talk about this idea that jazz is kind of a national treasure, no longer a common pastime. And I just thought this would be kind of interesting because, if nothing else, this is just one more illustration of how, when we are Christians, we really want to learn how to apply a biblical point of view to every area of life. And whether it's music or whether it's art or whether it's our culture, really just the need to kind of think biblically about some of these issues. And so that's one of the reasons why I thought this would be a great conversation today. And I might just mention that we've posted this article because it will help you maybe think about these areas. And so often when we even talk about cultural apologetics, we almost always naturally gravitate to classical literature, to classical music, all of which is very important. But the fact that he actually has written about this idea of jazz and how it can shape apologetics, I think is really a great idea. And as he says, his goal there is not necessarily to evangelize for jazz, but to simply say that if nothing else, many of the students that he's had over the years at Denver Seminary and all these different institutions where he's teaching really have known very little about that. And so I thought it'd be kind of an interesting way in which to have some of this conversation to take place. And so, again, that's one of the reasons we brought him on the program today. And if you would like to read about this, there's a couple of articles we've posted. One of those, How Jazz Can Shape Apologetics, as well as another one from a number of years ago on how to listen to jazz. And Doug, I guess we'll get you back now, but let's see if we can talk about that, because I mentioned the fact that when you use references to jazz, your students don't even know what you're talking about, and it does only occupy a fairly small fraction of the music market. So talk a little bit more about why you mentioned some of these references to jazz when you talk to your students there at the seminary.
Yes, I think jazz is an underappreciated musical form today. Last I checked, I think if you talk about the music market, as you mentioned, it makes up about 1% of the purchases in music. But obviously in a fallen world, that doesn't mean a whole lot, because something that is objectively terrific can be underappreciated by people. But I find in jazz a very rich heritage of American culture. It's a uniquely American art form, developed around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, largely in New Orleans. It came out of the blues, and before that, spirituals, and largely the contribution of the African American community. But not only that, there are people of other ethnicities that have contributed tremendously. So I find aspects of jazz, the elements of teamwork and improvisation and respect for tradition, and so on, developing musical excellence, to be analogous to virtues in the Christian life. So there are a lot of reasons, I think, to be interested in jazz. I think, sadly, jazz has kind of a bad name in some circles, partially because of its origins. There's a lot of dispute about the origins of jazz,
right.
Really kind of like the origins of Gnosticism. It's an ongoing question. However, some of it was rooted in the dark side of New Orleans culture, the brothels and the bars and so on. But that doesn't mean there's nothing worth conserving there, and we should be scavengers for common grace. There's a lot of good things in the world that God gives to believers and unbelievers. So I find musical excellence, I find rich history, a lot there about the relationship of the races, because jazz groups integrated before society as a whole became more integrated. So there's a lot there, and if students take my classes, they'll usually hear something about jazz one way or the other.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I'll kind of convene class here a little bit, and we'll get into a little bit more about what is jazz, although we've given a little bit of history in that regard. This whole idea of improvisation, I had my oldest daughter actually went into jazz studies at North Texas. To show you how dedicated she was, she named her cat Ellington, so that probably gives you a little bit of an idea. And I learned a lot about this idea of improvisation, as well as just some other issues that we're going to get into as well. So I think for those of you that are music lovers, you'll appreciate that. Or those of you that are not, I think you can sit back and learn some things as we talk about how jazz can shape apologetics. And we are privileged to have with us Dr. Douglas Groothuis. We'll continue our conversation with him, and then we'll open up the phones to get your comments. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democrats in the House of Representatives are moving a bill that would more than double the nationwide minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's all part of the campaign to fight for 15 that may be doing more harm than good. I've documented in previous commentaries that there will be winners and losers. The winners are those who receive the bump in pay. The losers are those who receive a pink slip or aren't even hired in the first place. The editors at the Wall Street Journal notice what is happening in New York City when the minimum wage rose again on December 31st. Businesses with 11 or more workers must pay $15 an hour. They wonder if it is mere coincidence that the city's full-service restaurants have fallen into a jobs recession. Employment in January dropped more than 3%, and it appears like it dropped a little bit more in February. The New York City Hospitality Alliance surveyed hundreds of eateries last year and found that nearly half planned to eliminate jobs in 2019 due to higher labor costs. 3/4 plan to cut employee hours. The editors also point to a research paper that raises a question that never occurred to me. The economists found robust evidence that minimum wage hikes increase property crime arrest among teenagers and young adults ages 16 to 24, a population for whom minimum wages are likely to bind. The economists provide some sobering estimates about the possible increased costs due to property crimes. The current bill in Congress makes no adjustment for the cost of living, so the editors conclude that a cashier in New York, Texas, population 9, cannot be paid a dime less than the $15 an hour due in New York City. If passed, this bill could do significant harm. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Douglas Groothuis with us today, an individual that, of course, we've had on the program many times before, professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary, and one of the articles we've posted here, How Jazz Can Shape Apologetics. You might say, well, how does that fit? And I think it's kind of interesting because one historian said that there are really three things that are uniquely American: the Constitution, conversation we had last hour, baseball, and jazz. And I would certainly agree with that. And yet, Doug, you even in this article talk about the fact that you brought a campus minister and longtime friend with you to a jazz concert, and afterward he said, well, the music has a center, but I cannot find it. But you told him, well, I have found it. And so in some respects, for some of our listeners that might say, I'm not the kind of person that would go and download a jazz piece or even go to a jazz concert, let's, if we can, give them a little bit of history about jazz. You talked about New Orleans. You talked about its origins are a little bit clouded, but at the same time, it is really a uniquely American musical form, isn't it?
It is. It's certainly migrated around the world. There's a tremendous jazz scene in France and also Japan, interestingly. A lot of African-American jazz musicians in the 40s and 50s, and even before that, went to France to live because the culture was much more hospitable to African-Americans without discriminating against them, and they loved the music. So there's really so much to jazz. It's like anything human. You've got the sordid and the wonderful, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. But there are certain elements of jazz that I appreciate. In fact, you were playing a little bit of jazz. I think I heard it anyway. I think the audience may have heard it too. And there's the sense of the idea of swing, which
Right.
is different than a rock beat. It kind of bounces and dances and carries you along. And the idea of swinging doesn't mean the 60s swinging, that kind of sexual immorality, but improvising and kind of dancing with other people through life. And Duke Ellington performed a song many times. I think he wrote it, called "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing."
That's right. Yeah.
And the idea of swinging is basically to improvise on themes and to understand tradition. Jazz always works within a tradition. So you have the idea of standards in jazz that everybody can play, like Summertime or maybe some of the Duke Ellington tunes, although they can be difficult to play. So you can relate this to apologetics, let's say, with standard apologetic arguments, such as the design argument for God's existence, the moral argument for God's existence, evidence for the resurrection, the uniqueness of Christ. He wasn't a legend, he wasn't a liar, he wasn't a lunatic, he was Lord. So we have these standard arguments, but then we bring them to bear improvisationally in various settings, whether it's a sermon, a lecture, a discussion, a panel discussion, whatever it is. So the idea of improvisation is not winging it. It's not doing anything you feel like doing, irrespective of others. It's bringing your unique personality into a tradition for the sake of creating something truthful and beautiful.
You know, one of the conversations we had just a few weeks ago was with Dr. Paul Gould. His book is entitled Cultural Apologetics. And in this society where it is become sort of mundane, because once you have kind of a secular view and you just eliminate the supernatural, you also sometimes eliminate beauty, the belief in truth, all sorts of other ideas. And it does seem to me that sometimes the best way to get to an individual is to bypass the intellectual and go to the emotional. And it seems to me that whatever that musical form or artistic form might take, we're of course focusing at the moment on jazz, that's just another aspect of apologetics. And that idea of improvisation, sometimes we have some people that are almost like robots, you know, they just give you all the linear, logical facts. And I'm finding that this next generation, maybe this pulls a little bit from your book on truth decay and postmodernism, they're maybe not necessarily influenced as easily by facts and linear logical arguments, but they might be more open to the gospel, more open to the belief in God because of some of the things in the musical world, in the cultural world. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think so. I think the aesthetic dimension of life doesn't preclude the intellect, but it does speak to a certain part of us. So, for example, there is a classic recording called A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, which came out in the early 60s. Now, from what I can tell, John Coltrane was not a Christian, but he was a believer in God, and he was something of a mystic. And that album speaks about a supreme being and that we should be humble before that supreme being. There's no lyrics to the album except where John Coltrane simply says, a love supreme, many times. So I could recommend a non-Christian listen to that album. It's 33 minutes, and it's good to listen to the whole thing at once without any distractions, and to read the material in the liner notes, and simply maybe view that as a point of possibility for thinking about the transcendent, thinking about God, and how we relate to God. And is there a supreme lover in the universe? There is. His name is Jesus Christ. Now, John Coltrane didn't mention Jesus Christ, but he might be a point of contact to resonate with a spiritual dimension, and then we can perhaps continue the discussion from there. Now, the music doesn't have any lyrics besides 3 words, a love supreme, and they're basically chanted. But that chant has content. And Christianity, among all the religions and all the worldviews of the world, makes sense of love because God is love. And love is primary. And as Augustine and C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer said, Love has always existed in the three persons of the Trinity. That's basic to all reality. And John tells us in chapter 3 that God so loved the world, he sent his only son. Love has a face. Love has a historical personage, Jesus. So you might be able to use that album or other aspects of John Coltrane's music and thinking as a bridge into the gospel.
And I just think this is a great idea. That's why I wanted to focus on some of this today, because there may be other ways to reach your non-Christian friends. And we so often talk about giving you various tools for your apologetic toolbox or your evangelism toolbox, however you want to look at that. But some of those almost always sound like kind of the standard apologetic arguments. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use those. Matter of fact, you're talking to two individuals that do, obviously, but there might be a different way to begin to focus on that. And so that's one of those ideas. What about this other idea of improvisation? You know, it does seem to me that as I've listened to jazz, and certainly having a daughter that worked in that area, I began to realize that you have kind of sometimes a solo of improvisation. Sometimes you have a group improvisation, but you believe that that's another kind of aspect to think about from an apologetic standpoint. What would you say?
Well, I do, and apologists need to have a mastery of, as I said, the standards, the arguments that we have for God's existence, reliability of the Bible, deity of Christ, resurrection of Christ, and we think about that now, Holy Week, and culminating in Easter. But we also need the skills to help people listen to us and to say the right thing at the right time. So I can talk for hours about arguments for God's existence, but if I'm talking to an unbeliever, I may only have 15 minutes to get her interested, to get him interested in the idea that believing in God is not an irrational leap of faith. So I think of a conversation I had several years ago, and this young man actually said something very insulting to me about being a Christian, basically that I was a jerk, and that was not the word he used. And I thought, well, why are you not a Christian? Why are you an atheist? And I said, have you ever heard of intelligent design or the fine-tuning argument? He said no, and I said, why don't you go to YouTube, type in intelligent design, and look at all the evidence from cosmology that the universe is fine-tuned for life. There's a mind behind the world. That was all I said. And I later found out that he did go and look at those, and I don't know what the effect was, because that was not an ongoing relationship. It was more of a one-off or a two-off interaction, but I didn't say, okay, buddy, you called me a name, now listen for 20 minutes because I teach philosophy. I had to improvise.
That's right. Let's take a break because I need to continue that conversation, but we have one of those mandatory breaks, and we are privileged to be talking today with Dr. Douglas Groothuis. If you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his website and all sorts of great resources you're going to find there. We need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with him and then with you right after this.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Douglas Groothuis with us, who is not only an apologist and a philosopher and a professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary, but also a fan of jazz. And one of the articles we've posted, How Jazz Can Shape Apologetics, kind of working our way through that one, but I also posted another one that he wrote a couple of years before, How to Listen to Jazz. And if you say, I've listened to this jazz music, I don't get it exactly, I think you'll find some of that very helpful. But I'd love to hear from some of you. Maybe some of you are fans of jazz music or even have used music or other forms of art to actually witness. I think there are some great opportunities to do so. So again, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Matter of fact, my producer Steve was just mentioning that Tim Keller mentions the liner notes from Coltrane's Love Supreme in his book, Every Good Endeavor. And we were just looking up a couple of quotes from John Coltrane just a minute ago. So just, again, something else to get you thinking about. These build bridges to the non-Christian world. This is a way in which you can use the cultural environment in which we find ourselves, the opportunities to build some bridges in a way that might make you more effective. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that today here on Point of View. And Doug, for just a minute, we were talking about this idea of improvisation, but there's also another I, and it's interaction, because jazz music really involves kind of an interaction, what you maybe call and response. You see this in the music, but you also see it in when we're doing evangelism or apologetics. Can you speak to that issue?
Yes, definitely. Duke Ellington said the first thing about music is listening. So we think, no, it's playing. But really, you want to listen to your environment and then listen in jazz to what the other musicians are playing. And one thing I really richly enjoy about a jazz concert live is watching and listening to how the music develops in accordance with what is called group improvisation. So a soloist, a saxophonist, say, may be playing a solo, and the drummer is actually matching what he's doing on the saxophone on his drums. And sometimes you'll see the musicians smile at each other without saying a word.
Yes.
Or in some cases, they don't even look at each other, but they're listening so deeply that they are interacting and resonating with each other. It's a kind of ongoing dialogue that's not scripted, but it's extremely profound because it requires the skill of response and then the skill of listening. And when we're interacting with anyone, whether it's a Christian or not a Christian, we recognize that that person is made in the image of God, so they're worthy of attention. And then we try to discover the questions behind the questions they may have. And we want to listen skillfully before we respond. So I find a lot of, first of all, just enjoyment in what jazz is as a gift from God in so many ways. And then secondly, virtues and skills that we find in jazz that are transferable into other settings.
Well, and again, as you point out, listening, how important. I've said before that I think people that are going to be really effective in evangelism or apologetics are good listeners and good at asking questions. And if you think about this, right, Jesus probably asked more questions than he gave answers, especially in the early part of his ministry. So if Jesus, who certainly knows a lot more than we do, was asking questions, now obviously to make a point, but nevertheless asking questions very important and listening very important. And sometimes that gets lost when we train an individual to learn some of the arguments that kind of like just want to dump the whole load of hay on an individual instead of really kind of figuring out where the person is in the first place.
That's true. And one of the skills in jazz is not overdoing it, holding back sometimes. And I won't say who it is, but I saw a jazz saxophonist recently who didn't seem to hold back anything. And
I think I know who you're talking about, but that's okay.
It was a little bit too much. And sometimes you need to refrain. You need to be quiet and listen, or maybe like with professors, good night, we can lecture on hours about so many things, but we have to tell ourselves to be quiet and elicit a response and not just try to win the argument, but be a loving person and give whatever truth we have patiently and step by step, and maybe, well, have more of a dialogue than a monologue.
Well, we got some calls, so let's, as we work our way through that, take your phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just kind of sit back and listen. That's actually one of the things we've been talking about here today. But I'd like to go to South Carolina first. Becky, I think you're a music teacher, and I'd love to get your comments today.
Well, I was so excited. Thank you so much for your program. I just literally got out of class. I teach at our little college here, and we just did Gershwin. We just did Porgy and Bess in summertime. And as a Christian, my husband and I both have our masters from seminary in Fort Worth, and music obviously speaks to us. I'm a pianist. That's my gifting. But I love what you're talking about with jazz. But basics, just go back to basic theory, triads, the building block of all music, CEG. This is how we build in Western culture. This is how we build our chords. And I've had so many students. I always pray with my piano students in my private studio before we play. But I said, music doesn't start with you. Music starts with God. He's creator. He's the sounds that we have, just the fact that I can hear a tone and say it's major or minor, just the fact that why can't Beethoven's Fifth speak to people all around the world? I mean, there's so many things. Jazz is so difficult, and I love what you were talking about, improvisation. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. It's so exciting to hear the connection between divinity and music, because often in our culture, especially in the South, if we don't have money for our schools, the first thing to go are the arts.
Isn't that sad?
And jazz, my soul can be lifted. I can listen to Bloom Ditto, or I can pull up, Charlie Bird or Dizzy Gillespie, and my heart, there is so much depth in good jazz, and exactly what you're talking about with questions. I was just rereading the Gospels for Passion Week, and what is the first word out of Jesus' mouth recorded? Why? Why didn't you know I'd be about my Father's business? And I love that as a mother and as a teacher. I love that people need to listen. And anyway, I will stop and just thank you for your program so much.
Need to get you on the program next time you come back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But I think Becky's got a good point, and that is whether it's the basics, just musical tones, triads, chords, things of that nature. There are just a lot of ways in which, as I've talked about before, cultural apologetics are very important, and this focus on beauty and art are another way to open up the gospel, I think, to a generation that desperately needs it.
Well, I agree, and as Becky said, music is a universal language, and it ultimately comes from God. It's not something that just popped up at some point in a unguided evolutionary history of sentient beings. Music is a discovery as well as a creation. So there's a deep theological dimension to all of this. James tells us in James 1 that God is the giver of every good and perfect gift, and Jesus tells us that good weather, the rain, is given to the just and the unjust. So we can find a lot of beauty and human excellence in musicians and composers that don't even recognize God. But still, inasmuch as they're bringing goodness into the world through music, they are, whether they know it or not, serving the Lord, at least with respect to art. And that opens up a tremendous dimension of human enjoyment, cultural analysis, apologetics. And let me go back to something you mentioned about Paul Gould's book, Cultural Apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen him give a presentation on that, and I've met him a few times. Haven't read the whole book yet, but I recommend that highly because he's talking about re-enchanting the world and showing that the world is far more than a materialistic story. It's far more than what chemistry, biology, and physics can tell us. Or even those things, though, point to God as the designer.
Yes.
But there is a spiritual dimension of stories and music, poetry, and so many things. And they're all good gifts from one God.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about a couple things. Syncopation, we haven't mentioned that word yet. And also we'll focus a little bit of time and attention on the website by Doug Groothuis. It's douglasgroothuis.com, but you don't even need to know how to spell it because we have a link there. And that's the way you can find out about a lot of his books. So Walking Through Twilight is one we talked about last time, but also, of course, some of his classical books on Christian apologetics, as well as on the New Age movement and much more. All of it available on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we have with us for just a few more minutes Dr. Doug Groothuis. And again, if you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his website, douglasgroothuis.com. Let me first of all suggest that some of his books would be just great reading for you if you are not familiar with those. Last time, of course, we had him on, we talked about Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament, and talks about losing his wife Becky, and of course that is certainly one. Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Christian Faith. Of course, I've mentioned many of his books dealing with things like the New Age movement. His one on truth decay, perhaps the best book on the subject of postmodernism. if you really want to understand Blaise Pascal, that was, of course, what he did in his doctoral work, is also written on that as well, and many other books that I would recommend. But also, if you'd like to have him come and speak in your church or your academic setting, there is a contact opportunity for you to contact him and find out a little bit more in terms of speaking, as well as all sorts of other resources. And so, Doug, I just wanted to mention that for people that would like to have you come. And again, it's been a kind of a season of your life where you've had to be at home when your wife, Becky, was dying. But now there's an opportunity for you to go and to speak. And I want to encourage people to consider scheduling you for some of those opportunities. And next time I'm doing some apologetics conferences, I want to get you there as well. So just another opportunity, and it's all on our website, pointofview.net, which links to douglasgroothuis.com. But Douglas, if we can talk about just in the next few minutes, syncopation, because that's another word that might be strange for people that have never really gotten into jazz music, but you have some very interesting insights in that regard as well. What would you like to share with our audience?
Yes, that's something that's really fundamental to jazz, and it means to accentuate the offbeat. And we use that expression often, the offbeat, something different or something unexpected. So jazz typically has a steady beat to it, but you'll hear unexpected emphases, like the drummer is keeping time mostly on the cymbal, the hi-hat, and the snare, and then there'll be the bass drum come in on the offbeat, as opposed to rock where the bass drum really is the main beat. So syncopating in a larger sense has to do with, I'd say, in some ways being a holy fool for the Lord, that is willing to be offbeat for the sake of the kingdom of God. Think of Jesus, and I mean holy fool in the sense of someone who is more righteous than the world typically is, so they seem to be weird. So think of Jesus in Luke 19, where he sees a man up in a tree, Zacchaeus, and he says, Zacchaeus, come down. We need to eat together. That was syncopating. And we find out that Zacchaeus, who was an unjust tax collector, decides to repent and to pay back the people he's wronged even more than he has to by virtue of the Mosaic law. And Jesus says, salvation has come to this place, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So that's offbeat, but it's the right beat. It's the right thing. I think in life, in terms of helping those in need and being kind to strangers, opening your house to radical hospitality, the way Francis and Edith Schaefer did at L'Abri and is still done at the L'Abris around the world, is a way of holy syncopation.
Matter of fact, one of the things that you use is an illustration from Francis Schaeffer. And, of course, I try to mention Francis Schaeffer every once in a while on this program because we have a generation that knows not Schaeffer, as I've said before. But you're talking about here this woman that had kind of an odd objection to becoming a Christian. Now, tell the rest of the story because it's a good an illustration of taking some ideas or maybe asking a question or pointing out something that maybe rattles their cages and kind of thinks outside the box. And that's kind of syncopation, isn't it?
Right. Os Guinness knows that Francis Schaeffer was the best one-on-one apologist and evangelist he had ever seen. And Schaeffer was talking to a woman who's not a Christian, and her main reason for not being a Christian was that God required animal sacrifices in the Hebrew sacrificial situation, and she thought that was very cruel. And Schaeffer wasn't making any progress with her. And so he looked down at her shoes, and she had leather shoes on. And he said, well, you have leather shoes on. Do you think it's sometimes right to use animals for human benefit? And that opened up the discussion right there.
I just think it's such a great illustration because sometimes you have the opportunity, and again, you know, your idea of jazz syncopation, I thought was pretty good, is that you can just kind of rattle a person's cages long enough for them to say, oh, I never thought about that. And whether it's something that causes them to think outside of the box or whether it's to show a little bit of internal hypocrisy or whatever it might be, it's just a good piece indeed. Just before I let you go, one of the other pieces I posted, and this is something you posted in All About Jazz quite some time ago. This goes back about 4 years ago, but you wrote about how to listen to jazz. And I thought we might mention that as well, because some of our listeners might say, okay, I've never really thought about going and listening to jazz. Maybe I'll go to iTunes here, or I'll go to a place where maybe one of my friends I know has a jazz combo or something like that. But you give people, Stephen, a couple of suggestions on how to listen to jazz. So that's another resource we've made available. Any comments about what you might want to do there?
I think the best thing is to go to a jazz concert. I often take my friends and my students to a local jazz club I like very much called Dazzle Jazz, which is in downtown Denver. And I remember taking a student of mine to a concert by Ravi Coltrane, who is John Coltrane's son, who plays saxophone.
Wow.
And he plays some pretty challenging music. And my student was not that familiar with jazz, and he had his head down, his eyes closed. And I said, Tyler, are you okay? He said, yes, I'm just trying to listen as hard as I can. And he actually loved it. But in some cases, it requires a bit of focus to find the center of it. So it's an art form that at its best repays repeated listening and investigation. So I'd say actually do two things. Go to a jazz concert of like a high school group, and then go to a jazz concert of professionals, and you'll see the difference. And you'll also be able to take in the experience of the musicians interacting with each other, improvising. If it's a small venue, there's interaction with the crowd too, by the responses that you have to the solos. And if it's a small enough situation, you can talk to the musicians afterwards. It's not like a Rolling Stones concert where they do the gig and they fly off in a helicopter.
Right.
So you can talk to the musicians about how they played, their background, or something you noticed in their composition. And it's a very rich environment to be in.
It certainly is. Well, thank you for taking us through an hour on how jazz can shape apologetics, and even one on how to listen to jazz. And again, if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read more about that, or I'd like to read some of the other books by Doug Groothuis, we have a link to douglasgroothuis.com. And don't forget that you might want to have him come and speak. He has been sort of out of the speaking circuit for a while, but he's back into it, and I wanted to give you that opportunity as well. Doug, as always, fascinating. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I always enjoy it.
Again, the program is available to you to listen to again. Maybe you know somebody that would benefit from this. We do have a podcast, so you can actually maybe send that to someone. They would benefit from that as well. You can find all of that at our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, of course, we also have a button that says Join the Team Now. So I would encourage you to join with us if you appreciate the kind of conversation we've had even today. I hope that you'll take the time to join with us financially, because we are dependent upon your financial gifts to keep the program going. Want to thank Doug for his help behind the scenes. Also want to thank Steve for his help as well as his suggestion on this program. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong. It just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.